This video is going to be a quick explanation of a couple of ways to use strings of comma-separated values in MySQL. It's probably most useful if you're developing an API and have to accept strings to pass into procedures. So to start off, I've created an example table that we'll use throughout this. It's just called people, and it has rows of people with the ID, their name, and then a status number. I've also created a helper function that gives us a string of comma-separated values, and I've called that get CSV. And it takes two input parameters. The first is how many values you want. So let's say we want 10 values, and then the second one is the maximum of those values. So here we'll get 10 values between 1 and 100. The first use will be in queries that you can input a string of numbers right into it. So for example, if we go select from people where ID user in, and then give it a list. It'd be convenient if we could do the same thing but just drop a variable in there. So if we get a variable from it'd be convenient if we could just drop that into here. But you notice it only returns one value. So if we look at our CSV, the first value is 93. So our select query there just took the first valid variable from the string that is represented by CSV. The way we can do that is by using a prepared statement. So if we set a string to the exact query that we want, we can execute that. And we can do that by concatenating the fixed parts of our query with our variable. So let's set at query is equal to concatenate select star from people where ID user is equal to, and this is where we need to put in our variable and then finish the string with the closing bracket. Sorry, we need to include an opening bracket here. Let's just inspect query and see if that looks correct. Select star from people where ID user is in that list of values. And now to turn that into a statement that we can execute, we type prepare statement from query. Oh, okay, here's our problem. This should be an in, not an equal. And then to execute that, type execute statement. I've prepared a procedure that does the same thing. So we've got all the same. Set the string, prepare the statement, execute the statement. And I've also added a deallocate prepare statement because we're only going to execute it one time. So what about if we want to use this string to update our status column? A query might look something like this. Update people set status. Now this will this will set the status for all users to the same value. So status, let's say 5. where ID user in, say, 1, 2, 3. We can see we set those all to 5. And I've also created a procedure that does an update, which takes in a string of CSVs and a status. Let's try out those two procedures. So if we call CSV select, we use that CSV string we looked at before. And the select only takes that. We get a list of those statuses. If we call the CSV set, is that what I called it? No, CSV update. We'll do that same CSV string and give it a status of 11. And then run the select again. We can see we changed all of our statuses to 11. Next, we'll look at how we can update the status of each ID with a different value. So the first method I'll mention, but we won't go all the way through with, is you could use the insert into and then on duplicate key statement. So if we insert into people, ID user, status, and then give it a list of values. Now this part, you could pass this in as a string, where each value pair is put in parentheses. So the point here is we're trying to insert, but then the idea is that we've already got these values and we want to update them. So on duplicate, okay. We're going to update instead, where our status is equal to values status. And there we can see those values from there. But the method that I really want to point out is if you had two separate strings of comma separated values, the first string for the IDs and the second string for the statuses. So let's create a couple strings at set IDs. Let's go with 10 again. We'll go up to 100,000. Our table actually contains about 1.3 million records. Okay. Again, we need to have the same number, but let's say our statuses only go up to 150. Let's just check what we got. IDs and stats. So next we need to know how to extract variables out of these strings, and we're going to rely on a function called substring index. And how that works is we pass in a string, tell it what we want to index by, and in our case we want to index by commas, and then we tell it at which index to cut it off at. So if we start at 1, it's going to cut it off at the first comma. Oh, sorry, we need to add a select in front of that. we see we get only the first value. If we go to the second value, so on until we get to the last couple. And one thing to note is if you keep going past those, you just keep getting the whole string. So now an important variant of that is if we use negative numbers, it starts at the other end of the string. Again, all the way up to 10, and past that gets you the whole string again. We can combine two substring index statements to get a single value. So let's say we want the third value from our string. So we're just going to start on the inside. So to the outer substring index, we're just going to pass the result of the inner of another substring index. And the inner one, we're going to start with the string that we want to get everything from. Again, separated by commas. And we said we're going to go with the third one. And then in the outer one, again, comma delimiter. And we're going to use -1. We want to get the rightmost value from the result of the inner substring index. Okay, so there we got our single value. We also need to know how to determine how to get how many variables we have. So the way to do that is to use the length of the original string and subtract the length of the string with the commas removed. So we're going to replace all our commas with an empty string. Okay, so it tells us we have 9, but we know we selected 10 before. And so therefore we need to add one more. And that's because we don't have a trailing comma. Okay, so now we get the correct result. Let's use this information to create a procedure that gives us a temporary table that we can use to update our actual table. So let's go into dbeaver, create a new procedure, and let's just call this CSV table. And we're going to take in two strings, one string for IDs and one string for our statuses. So give it an in IDs. We'll make it a varchar with a 256 length. Another in. We'll call it stats. And we'll go with the same length. We need to declare a few variables. Let's declare a variable for how many variables we're passing in. So let's just go no vars. We'll call that in, and we'll make it an integer. I'm going to create an integer to step through our values. We'll just call it I int, and let's make it a default of 1. Let's set no vars to the number of vars that we have. So no vars equal to the length of IDs minus the length of a replace, and we're replacing the commas in our ID string with nothing. And then we add 1 because we don't have a trailing comma. Now we want to create a temporary table, but we need to drop it first if it exists. So let's drop table if exists. And let's call our table CSV TBL. And then we'll create our temporary table, CSV table. And let's just give it a key. Have an integer, and that'll be our primary key. Give it an ID, which is also an integer, and a stat, which is again an integer. Now let's step through the values that we passed in and insert them into our temporary table. So we'll use a while loop. So while I is less than or equal to the number of variables, do the following. We're going to insert into CSV table for our values, a value of k, or our key, we're just going to use I. And then our next two values, we're going to use our substring indexes to extract the values. We do the IDs first. And the value of the position that we want is going to be I. And then again a -1 for our outer. We'll put our stats. Now we need to increment our 1, or our I. And commit our procedure. And let's go make sure it worked okay. So let's call CSV table with the two strings we created before going in there. So at IDs, at stats. It says that's okay. Now we should be able to select from, what do we, CSV TBL. There we go. Now we have a table. This table will be overwritten every time you call the CSV table procedure. We can use this temporary table to update our people table. Let's first use our CSV select procedure to check the statuses for these IDs in our people table. We can update our people table with our temporary table by joining them within an update statement. Join them on the same IDs. So within our people table, it's ID user, so p.id user, and on our temporary table, it is just ID. So see where p.id user is equal to c.id. And we're going to set our p.status to our c.stat. And it appears to be successful with 10 rows affected. Let's call our CSV select again and see if it really did work. I'll just select our stats to check. So our CSV select ends up sorting by the ID user. So let's just select our temporary table and order it the same, and we'll just have a quick compare. Let's look at the 2, 35, 5, 36, 129, and so on. Yeah. So we've successfully taken in CSV strings and updated our table. I hope you found this useful, and thank you for listening.